Okay, welcome everybody. Just let me know if you guys have any audio or I have any audio problems. And just hit me up in the chat. For that, hopefully the music's not too loud. Okay, so today, sounds good? Okay, perfect. Today we're going to be looking, I'm just going to switch to the old Cintiq here. We're going to be looking at continuing on with our zombie design that we had started last week. Excuse me. And we're going to be adding some lighting and continuing on to color, hopefully, within a couple hours we're going to spend on her. So yeah, I mean, the idea behind this initially was obviously inspired by something like The Last of Us. Do our own little zombie design here where we're getting these kind of spores or fungal sort of blossoms, I guess you could say, coming out of our zombie character. The side goal for me, which I didn't really bring up last stream, was that I wanted some of these spores to have a to be throwing off some light, right? So sort of like a what am I trying to say? Bioluminescence, so that the zombie could be an interesting sort of addition to a class of zombie that you could see in the dark, but also that lights up its space so it can see. So we'll get there if we can, but we want to build up first some of the sense of the volume with our lighting, breaking up some of the values in the character as well. So let's tuck into it. I did block out a silhouette for this character underneath the line work to be working on so that I can just lock those pixels. Right now it's locked just so I don't mess it up, but I'll lock those pixels. I tend to want to make copies of these things if I'm going to destructively edit with whatever, if I'm painting value in or color on top, just in case I screw up. Then I can come back to something that's preserved. It's not too big of a deal because if I paint on this and I mess it up, I can always just keep it locked and just paint it back down to the initial grayscale that I was using there. So let us get started on that. One of the things, because I'm going to start painting with light to create those volumes, is the background is so contrasty right now, being white, that I will be better off setting that up with maybe more of a mid-tone so that I can start to finesse some of the lighting without it being kind of something that's screaming at me. So let's check that out. We'll just go down and start a new background. And I'm just going to fill that with not the same mid-tone as I'm dealing with, just because I do want some breakup, just something a little bit darker in there. So we get something like that. I do have some ground grid lines I'm going to turn to multiply just so that they're not brighter than I need them to be. And there we go. So we'll turn that guy off and we'll start kind of getting in there with the lighting. So if any lighting is going to be coming into this scene, I know that I don't want it to compete on a level where any of our bioluminescence isn't going to be able to show up very well. So I don't want like a really extreme bright light. I'm kind of imagining this character walking around in a really dark space. So with that said, I'm going to create sort of an overhead lighting just so that we can create a sense of self-shadow, form shadow, and pull out some of the forms on the body there. So a lot of the times I'll start with a black, maybe somewhere close to 0% brightness. And I'll have this on pen pressure so I can really start feathering things in. I, of course, can go all the way to black, which isn't super useful to be seeing any of the detail, right? So with that, I want to make sure I'm measuring the intensity of how hard I'm pressing on the brush to get that looking good. Oops, I deleted the whole thing. That's why you make a copy. So let's bring this closer and get in there. So that general light source, I mean, something I tell my students all the time is set yourself up with some indication of your initial light source direction, just so that you're not trying to always remember exactly where it is. If you can visualize a general direction, then you can kind of start looking at all the forms with that same direction in mind, and save yourself some stress, I guess. I don't know if that's stressful, but I'll even lock that. I'll put it in as light arrow, lock it, and then we'll get back to this layer, which I'm going to name as our silhouette for short. It's always good just to kind of point form, name your layers as you go. I could probably go back through there and do that. I would definitely do this for a client, right? By the end, just go through and make sure that I organize those, or when it ever gets too kind of out of control for you, just make sure you go back in and then label those things. So in general, I want to start building up that general direction of light. I don't want to get into the details, which I see a lot of people do when they start kind of lighting things, and people that struggle with it, they don't really know why, things get away from them. It tends to be just because they're overcomplicating it from the beginning, right? So work with the biggest forms first. Get a sense of, the legs are like tubular forms, so you can start to bring that tubular form out in a very general way. If we remove the line layer here, you can see that. So I'd be just going in there and finding areas where that would make sense. So I'm having a lot of that light come down and bounce off of kind of the center of her in a way. So the outside edges will be not reflecting light very well, or reflecting it away from our eyes or the camera. And those spores are going to cast some shadow in there, which will be good for when they light up. Excuse me. So something like this. Get that in there. Might add a little bit of darkness to those, because part of what might be nice in terms of contrast here is if the either the skin where the fungus comes out of, or the fungus itself is darker, so that when it becomes light, we can have some fun with kind of that contrast and really drawing the eye to that instead of the rest of the zombie, because I think the spores are really going to be the thing that draw attention, or have potential to, right? So get that going in there. I guess The Last of Us comes out on Friday. Anybody know? I think Friday. Can't remember. Just laying that in. I can get a little bit darker around the areas where I think it's really turning away from our light source. The photons are not able to get in there, or bounce around or reflect. Chris's question there: are you drawing on a pad like a Wacom or on a screen? I'm working on a Cintiq. So I have a Cintiq, which is sort of in the Wacom family of digitizers, and I'm looking at the artwork underneath the screen that I'm drawing on. So yeah, I prefer that. I've worked with people that actually have had access to them and opted not using them because they're too used to a tablet that they draw, say, on their desk, and they're looking up at a screen, right? For me, it's more like a sketchbook. So it's easier to, for me, again, for my workflow, for that to make sense where, I'm putting a mark with the pencil, that's where I see it show up, right? It's not perfect. You have to, for those that don't know about it, you have to calibrate it for where your head position is going to be on average, right? So that no matter where I place this thing on the screen, the processor, the programs will make sure that the mark is made underneath the pen tip. Because what can happen is if you don't set that up, you'll start seeing the pen or the stroke drawing. It's seemingly kind of too far away from your pencil tip, which can look weird. I'm sure you could get used to it, but yeah. Okay, so we're just going to keep going in here. So something else that we can do while we're starting to build up lighting in here, something you can do beforehand even is block out values. Say the difference of value between my hair, my skin tone, and my glasses and my headphones here, right? They're different values, and we can very clearly see, for instance, the value of my glasses against my skin because there is some contrast there. So we can do that, say, with the shirt. I can add an overall pass of darker value on her shirt if I wanted to pull out the difference between her shirt, her skin, and other elements, maybe even like the spores on her as well, right? So you can start to kind of edge those, and we might want to do that with the shirt and the jeans. You can, different materials will have different values, like local values or reflective values. You could think of that as albedo value. And that means just sort of the reflective quality of the material itself. So snow would be a high reflective value. Black rubber tires would be a low reflective value. So, you know, jeans, where do they sit in there? Sort of just blue jeans, maybe somewhere in a mid-tone, right? Whereas depending on the skin tone of the character, it can be high or low, right? Reflective value. So for her, we'll go with a high reflective value as that's going to pop her out better against the darkness of, say, a tunnel or something like that. So, and that could be with a zombie, that could be discoloration from, you know, the decay or that kind of thing even. So, or even I suppose the fungus. Patrick, your question here. Do you always start the rendering phase with soft shading and then go into add hard edges? I tend to, because if there's many different workflows that you can assume, I guess, when you're building these kinds of things. For me, I like to do that because I'm not getting a sharp edge can sometimes be something that is going to grip your attention as detail. And so for me, I don't want to get there yet. I don't want to start being distracted by that stuff. I want to kind of just lay in these things very softly to get a sense of it. Excuse me. And then make the adjustments after that, right? But some people you'll see, they'll use a hard edge round brush and they'll be kind of stroking on top of other strokes. And you'll get this kind of build up noise, and there's a certain aesthetic to that. And some people really like that for getting a sense of noise even, or texture. I wouldn't be averse to it, but I tend towards this just so I can start to get a sense of what I'm looking at. Yeah, good question. Okay, so let's just keep going with this in here. So I've built this look, and you can see some of the strokes are a bit patchy there. I can always sample other values and kind of bring them back. Say on the chest region as a rounded form, or the shoulders a rounded form, if it's not, you know, feeling great. And so I can move at some point into the finer detail. And what you might see me do is get closer and closer and closer to this, right? As I start resolving that detail to a higher fidelity. So let's, I mean, I'm pretty happy with the rough cut here. I feel like her hands, like zombies are going to be crawling around and, you know, decaying, I suppose, or tearing away at flesh, all the gory stuff that they like to do. So I feel like the hands might be something that are really kind of dark and roughed up, and almost like evidence of them being kind of in contact with dirt and blood and all that stuff, all that fun stuff. So maybe that foot at the back as well, a little bit. She's wearing shoes on this side, so I'll kind of leave that. What I like to play with, though, is maybe as these elements blossom out of the body, maybe they start very dark. And as they kind of branch out, maybe the skin on the fungus becomes thin so that that bioluminescence can come out. So maybe we get something of a slow gradient contrast from the root to, let's say, I don't know, the fruiting body, right? Of that in there. Which would be nice because against her hair, which maybe will leave light, against her skin, that would be something we could detect fairly easily, right? So I could go around and then start hitting those areas at the root of these things with darker discoloration, darker values. And that might even be how it moves and sprouts out of the skin. It's sort of the transition we'll see out of that, which is helpful for us, right? And speaks to the kind of zombification or decay, which can be cool. Let's go around there. And again, I'm being very airbrushy about this, non-committal, not yet, right? I'm just kind of seeing what that will look like, and I can still be a very experimental at this stage, which is handy, right? Might have some internal organs coming out there, or that was the initial idea. Maybe we'll see how it goes. Maybe it's just sort of twisted skin in there or something. As those things blossom outward, give some of that loving into this section here. Maybe some stains on the pants where these formations are coming out of. Add to the believability of the decay affecting the materials that are wrapped around the zombie. So we might get some subtle spotting on the leg there as it's almost like bruising where these things are coming out of, which now I'm starting to get into more of that detail, right? So I would say that's at least a good start in there. So, but you will see at this point is like I didn't start with all of that stuff first, right? I started with something where I could get a sense of that form. And then again, when we take this off, you start to see how that's coming together. Now you start to see that detail creeping in. I still don't want to get in here like this and start painting really close, right? Because I'm not at that, I'm not committing at that level yet. So Patrick, I see your values are really close together. You save the dark/light value more for the end, adding details. I do, yeah. So good that you caught that. I don't want to overexpose or way underexpose my highlights and then my shadows yet, right? If I wanted to do those things, typically you don't. It can be an aesthetic that you're after in photography and painting, of course, where you use overexposure as an aesthetic element. In novice work, I see that just happens by accident a lot of the times, and it wasn't intended. So yeah, I tend to save that, and something that's good to remember is sort of like the 10% at the top, 10% at the bottom. That way, you know, you're not kind of going too far with it, right? So again, something to remember with this is like these are workflows that are specific to me. And I've learned these workflows from working in the industry, obviously, but also things that just have worked for me, things that feel good for my painting, and that allowed me to get this stuff done. So there are other workflows and people you'll run into who will prefer a different way, right? So for yourself, kind of feeling out what that is for you, making sure that you're tying that into, you know, efficiency is a good thing. Okay, so we got this kind of general sense of those elements. It doesn't mean that I can't go in and work more with those things, but it's at least a pretty good start for us, right? At this point, I can have some fun and start thinking about what that final look could look like, right? So sort of like what you're talking about with the workflows. That being something that I don't always have to adhere to. So my camera's not, there we go. So, you know, if I'm ever kind of curious what the end goal might look like, if I feel like I'm risking not getting there, or I feel like I'm not sure, or even if I'm just taking a break and I want to play, right? I'll get in there and maybe I'll start putting some really bright values in to start looking at what it might look like by the time I get closer to finish with some of the blossoming forms that we've been talking about to this point. And be careful at this stage if you are taking a break, especially in studio life. You can get people walking by thinking that you're committing to something when you're really just kind of taking 5 minutes for yourself to chill out and not commit to ideas. And then they'll freak out maybe if they see something they don't like. I've had it happen. That's why I say it. But yeah, I mean, maybe I just go through and see, okay, what if these things were on there? You know, what that blossoming looks like. I think at that contrast level, it actually feels pretty good to me, at least for the vision that I had in mind. Of course, those things, if they're throwing off light, they're going to start casting light onto the forms of the rest of the body. So that can be something that we get to later, but I like where it's going. So anyway, I can go back in through there. And sometimes it's good to put it on its own layer. I didn't do that here, so oops, you guys caught me. But again, it's locked pixels, so I can just go back and kind of paint those down for now. I don't have my history level set up right now for it to be, I usually set up about 100 steps of history in Photoshop, just because I like to play around and edit undo a lot. It's not, I think it's set up maybe 20, 30 steps on default. I've had to roll back my Photoshop because the newest Photoshop, for whatever reason, I think a lot of people are experiencing some oddities with stroke pressure and whatnot. So anyway, I was able to roll it back because we have this thing locked and I can roll that back. But if I wanted to, I might just go onto a different layer next time to avoid that, if I remember to do that. Speed near sketch. I always try to go too early into the detail phase, trying to stay zoomed out for the most part, not working all the time. Yeah, I know. I mean, it still happens to me because you get distracted with how cool things could look, or you wonder what they could look like. And so you start testing it, but then commitment creeps in. You're like, I like that. I put all this time into it. Now I'm keeping it. And not always great for the client relationship there, because you start to overemphasize one area in detail when you should be delivering something maybe a little bit more general to them. So it can happen for sure. Okay. So yeah, I like the way that looked with the lighting in there. Something to talk about at this point is I can take this very slow if I have the time and really put a ton of detail and be careful about how I'm rendering things. In concept art, you don't always have that opportunity. So sometimes you have to go a little bit faster to get the job done. So I'm going to go a little bit faster. It can always be something that later I can finesse with that. So let's go for it in here. So one of the things, if I wanted to reduce the line impact, or at least in its contrast, because that's on its own layer in here, let's actually name that line, just so we're doing our due diligence. That's something else that I can lock and start to subtly paint down in its contrast, right? So now that I've locked all those pixels, I can paint just those pixels, right? So just as an example, I can go through here and paint that all white. Not super useful, right? At least overall. But I can pick something that is more mid-tone, and I can start to kind of knock some of that detail back so it's not as aggressive, allowing myself later to come in and paint on top of that any, excuse me, any dark shadows, right? So let us get into it. My camera's acting up today. Sorry about that. So we've locked that line layer down. Excuse me. And so I might start working on certain areas to bring that line layer in. One of the other things that we can do as an option for ourselves is you can keep that line layer and incorporate that as part of the overall shadow, right? Where everything on the edge is maybe going to become a little bit darker. How would I do that? I would make a copy of that line layer. So just drag that down to a new layer. I'm going to name our reserve layer just line. I'll just name it locked. And I'm going to leave that one alone. Lock it. That's our original line layer. We'll just turn it off. In case we need it again, we can go get it if we screw things up. So this line layer is now separate from my lower layer. And what you can do is you can actually just drop that down. Now you have to be very careful at this point to make sure that you want to do that because it's going to be some destructive editing that's going on. I'm going to combine my line layer with my value layer underneath. So whenever that does happen, we've made a copy of the line layer just in case we screw that up. But we should always maybe make a copy of our lower layer as well, and we can call that one silhouette locked. You guys can come up with your own labels. It's up to you, whatever makes sense to you. Then I'll lock that bad boy. And I have process layers down here as a folder. You can see that, hopefully, in here. So, you know, that's all of my process that I've built up over the lifespan of this painting. So I can grab those two things and I can just drag them down in there and they live there safely in case I need to go get them again. You do enough of this and your Photoshop file is going to balloon in size. So just be careful about that. If I ever have a file that becomes so unruly because it's so high res, I may opt to pull some of my layers out into a new Photoshop file and I'll keep a separate Photoshop file as backup, right? I can go get those layers, drop them in here. Not ideal, but I mean, that's a way to solve the problem, right? So I'm going to commit that line by just collapsing that, merging it down. The hotkey for that's Control E. And so now what we have is when I turn that layer off, we don't have anything underneath. Everything is now being combined on there. So, so how that's helpful to me is I can start to get into blending my blending brushes and start kind of blending my values in with some of the grayscale, right? Which is super handy as we kind of build some of these things up. This isn't the most amazing blending brush in the world. So I'm going to go find a better blending brush here. And one of the ways to think about blending brushes, which is nice for us, is that right now we kind of have, like, you can think of it as a thumb. That thumb and that's, well, it's a smudge brush. That thumb is going to just smudge the stroke very uniformly, right? But Photoshop can have different brush tip shapes that will sample and pull that pigment around in different ways. So if you find brush sets where we have some sort of stipple shape that we can use for blending, those are, you know, those are the ideal forms. So I've got a brush set here called Blur Good Brush, and you can Google that, find that. I think it's an old Photoshop set that it's sort of legacy for me. There's a million brushes online that you can get for free. So, you know, you can go find those smudge brushes out there. Lots of people are selling this stuff. So, I mean, you can buy it, but there's a ton of people that are just giving it away for free, right? So trying to find our good smudging brush in here. There are a lot of brushes in this set specifically. So, and I have I believe it's the original author is Chinese by descent, I think. So this is the non-English version. You can actually get a brush version of this where we get English labels. But I mean, I'm not too interested in what is labeled. I'm looking at the actual stroke to see what it offers me in the stroke preview. So we can try something like this as a smudge brush and see kind of how that works. So this one's a little bit better because it's going to kind of spread the pigment around less uniformly. But I can get into some of these spots where I start to, I'm getting close to it now, so it feels like I'm detailing it, which in a way I am. But I'm just trying to kind of blend those elements together a little bit more so that they're uniform, and I can start to rid us of that rigid line in there. Thank you for the follow. Okay, so let's go around here. I mean, this may be like a long, tedious sort of method of incorporating this stuff. So if you find you don't have a ton of time for this, you can always get in there again with your other brushes, your other, like your airbrush with your darker values, and start kind of popping those things in there. So for me, I feel like I need a little bit more power out of that. So I'm going to go into the brush tip shape settings. I'm going to go to the spacing and make it a little bit more dense. It's fairly uniform in there as well. We see kind of like a pattern emerging in the stroke. So you can go into the scatter dynamics and you can start to flip those things. I can maybe scatter the brush tip shape a little bit in there. Thank you for the follow. Sorry, I'm going to move my screen out here. Thank you, Maven, the Maven 17 for the follow. So yeah, we start with that. I can add transfer to that. I mean, if you guys are unaware of all of what the brush settings do, experiment with it. It's a really useful thing to be able to tweak your brush. So I've been using Autodesk Sketchbook. Yeah, Sketchbook I love Sketchbook for drawing. The stroke pressure control, it just seems a little bit more responsive than Photoshop by a little bit. It just seems more natural. Some of their drawing tools as well, like their rulers are pretty cool. Yeah, no, those for me also on iPad. Procreate. I wish Procreate. If someone's out there listening, Procreate, make a desktop app, because their tools are just so slick on the iPad Pro that I wish I had it as a drawing painting alternative on PC or Mac, even for that matter. So we see that I'm kind of building up that brush. I feel like it could probably be a little bit more dense, and you can always just be testing this, right? Like we've got this up. I may test it and just destroy some work right here. I can edit undo that, but see kind of how it's blending some of the pigment. It might be nice to even have that more dense. Let's see what that effect is. So that's, yeah, it's a pretty nice blend. I mean, you're going to get some stippling out of that because, of course, the brush tip shape has got these little dots on it. But that's at a certain size. If I make this really big, you can really see it, right? If I make it smaller, really small, it starts to become more difficult to read that. And with the transfer turned on, with pen pressure, I can softly start scumbling or smudging that pigment, right? So somewhere in there, right? I might over time finesse that brush if I feel like it's not achieving the look I want, but there you go. It's a little bit better than that thumb smudge for at least what I'm doing. Excuse me. So getting into here, starting to kind of smudge that. One of the knock-on effects of this specific smudge tool is that we're almost getting like skin pore texture out of it, which is pretty cool as a side effect, right? So that could work in our favor, depending on what texture you've got coming out of your brush tip shape. So, and again, if it's a little bit too rough cut for you, you can always change that later, right? We're just trying to build up some nice blending of some of these volumes that we've set up in here. I can always switch back to my value tool at this point and start kind of cutting in sharper edges, you'll see that over time, you can, even with an airbrush that's small, you can start to make edges that feel very rigid, right? On a large scale, they don't, but on a small scale, they can start to, right? So airbrush, really simple tool. I tell my students a lot of the times, when we go through our brush tutorials, that they'd be disappointed to know that I use fairly simple brushes overall. But it's really nice to have access to different textures and different kind of stamp shapes for brushes for different reasons if you need them, right? That's why I do have quite the range of brushes available to me, but I don't tend to use them all the time, just in kind of basic build-up of sketching. So, yeah, I know. I've actually written to Procreate. Sorry, I was reading the comment that you pay a lot of money for the desktop Procreate. Yeah, because I've written to them and they actually responded saying that they want to focus on the iPad. So I guess their team's not big enough to be working through all the troubleshooting you'd probably have to do with all of the different setups, different PC builds, different, even if they were to stick with Apple, the different Apple builds, right? So thank you for the follow. So yeah, I mean, like, come on. So I feel like at some point they're going to be successful enough with it that they can hire more people. I hope that's the case. Anyway, so yeah, let's, for today, we're going to continue with this, but I'm going to go with working with the head for now. What you will tend to want to do is do full passes on the body, but just, this is sort of like a primary focal point for us. So I feel like it'd be, excuse me, for the stream, probably a little bit better for us to focus on the primary stuff first. So let's get into it, shall we? So here's a good example of, like, I probably don't want a lot of this this darker value blended in on the tip of the fungus, because that's going to be bright. So I don't really need it to be having this light fall off like I might need to on the face or the rest of the body in there, right? So before I actually combined my line layer with my value layer, I might have just instead kind of washed in with an airbrush some lighter values. But again, it's not a big deal for us to make those changes on the fly. I can start to just blot that out. And what you're seeing is I'm getting this lighter value being dragged in somehow. And what's that from? It will tend to be that Photoshop will think that everything outside of that selection is your base, your background color, white, right? And so it'll start dragging that stuff in because it's guessing that that's sort of what you want. So in this case, it actually works really well. I can continue to kind of bring some of that light in around there. I don't want to do it everywhere because I do want some volume to be available to us, but it's a good way to get in there and work that in. Ooh, that looks pretty cool. So this is the other thing that I love about art is just emergent things that happen, those happy accidents, Bob Ross style, right? So the texture on at least the brush that I'm using right now feels pretty cool in terms of the stipple. I may want some of that and not want some of that later, right? So it can be something that that works well. If I make it really big, it might look, yeah, no, it destroys everything. Don't do that. I think it needs to be a little bit smaller in there. Beat the devil out of the brush. Hello, good to see you here. It's got to be late for you out there, Erica. Oh, maybe not. It's still early for me. So yeah, it's a nice quick solution, at least right now, for this. And you can see I've got a smaller brush. I'm starting to be able to take down some of the intensity of the dots or the stipple that I have in that upper section in there. So I can go pretty quickly through some of this, and it's always something we have to adopt for this, the sake of speed in the industry, is because people want to pay less and less for more and more work, right? That's why you get a lot of outsourcing. So you'll see a lot of concept artists use visual aids like 3D programs, posing programs, photo bashing to just kind of help get the artwork out. Because it is expensive to spend a ton of time. And that's when you become a more senior concept artist, you start to actually have to consider scoping your time, not only for yourself, but if you start managing other concept artists that are more junior, you have to know kind of what they can do and what time, and if whatever your client's asking for can actually be achieved, right? So, and in which case it can't, you have to figure out clever ways of getting that work done. So very interesting to some. For some people, they just want to do art. They don't want to be bothered with all of that management stuff, which, sometimes I can definitely understand in there. So yeah, just going through here, even just kind of breaking down some of those lines, keeping some aspects of them, because we start to get into something that's called edge control, and that is controlling your edges as it sounds, right? But you don't always want edges to be rigid. So you guys can, next time you're outside and you can see clouds, like cumulonimbus, big ones, right? Pay attention to the edges on that, right? You'll see some very rigid edges for something that is evaporated water, right? And then you'll also see where it starts to kind of fade off or evaporate into the air, right? So some of those edges will just be indiscernible. Some of them will be a little bit more discernible, and so on until you get into those very rigid, fluffy, sort of cotton-looking cloud edges. So we can do that. I mean, you'll see those edges appear and disappear in everything, clothing even, right? The folds in clothing can be really sharp when they're creased, and then slowly fade out onto, say, the shoulder of a shirt, right, where it's bound around a larger object that's pushing outward. So you won't see as many kind of edges in there, unless you don't iron your shirts. You're going to get lots of creases in there. Oh, it's only 9 for you? Awesome. Glad to have you. And it was your puppy's birthday. I saw that on Instagram. That was great. He's always looking super cute. You're looking to start concept art course with CG Spectrum, about to get a MacBook Pro and a Wacom Intuos. Yeah, great. I mean, that's a good setup. It's I work on a PC right now, but my old computer was a Mac, and that's what I worked on in my last studio job, was a Mac as well. So I can work on both. It just sort of like trying to get your mind into the Apple way of navigating a desktop versus a PC. Just takes a little while to connect. My wife has my old Mac right now. So yeah, so we're just like, we're getting in here, we're cleaning that stuff up. Depending on the time, of course, right? Always keep an eye on that. I want to touch most of those lines just so that we don't have the uniformity, so it looks like hand-drawn lines on top of that, at least in my first pass, right? Some clients will really want certain things to happen pretty quickly, but some will, not really care so much. So, or they'll want things to happen their way, right? So you might have to change your workflow a little bit to satisfy their needs, which is reasonable, right? They're paying the bills. Okay, so we got pretty good pass on her here. Into the clavicle there. And then we'll just even maybe hit these guys. We'll pull some of that white in on these. And I'm just a reminder on how I'm doing that. I'm just pulling from the outside in instead of, if I didn't want that look, I would start smudging from the inside to the outer edges so that I wouldn't pull in a lot of that white. So I could kind of do that here. It's just because this specific brush tip shape is pulling and scattering, it will still, we're seeing it still pull in. So I might, now that I see that, if I wanted to make that something more uniform, I might go and get just more of that thumb smudge brush and then pulling from the inside out there. But I don't want to do that, so this is fine. It works for us. Okay. So we had imagined that we'd kind of go through the whole rest of the piece in here and pay that attention. You know, we've got some smooth music on, and we can kind of just sit down with a coffee and go for it, right? So for, I think, a lot of people, a few of my students have not enjoyed rendering as much, but I think for a lot of people there's a catharsis there for kind of just coloring within the lines, right? Getting this thing to emerge with some effort on your part. So, but for us, I think I want to kind of just focus in on her face. It's also going to be a good way to kind of establish what the rest of her will look like, right? The very least as well, we're going to be focusing on one of the primary focal points. So if we weren't able to get as much effort in on everything else, we at least have the primary. Stay away from just doing your primary focal points, because a lot of the times, you know, if we zoom out, like, you run out of time and this is what your client sees. They may not love it, right? They may want to see the more work done, but you'd have to use your judgment on that. But we're going to go back into our face here. Take a look-see. So at this point, I can start adding. Right now, I've kind of really been focusing on the way I added the shadows to the midtones, but now I can get into dropping in some highlights as well to start building up where the light will bounce off of this character. So I can go back to my airbrush, which has been pretty handy for us so far. And because I can't draw any of that value into these interior guys, I might have to use my airbrush to paint that in. Just got a question here. How long did it take you to get to this stage of the drawing? This stage, I got, other than what you saw in the stream today, it was 2 hours in the last stream last week. So pretty quick. I get this question all the time from students. How long should I take? How long do you take? I hope I take less time than people who haven't practiced as much as me. Otherwise, that might look bad on me, right? But typically, you know, if you've got lots of experience in something, you're making less mistakes. You're kind of less distracted. You're not getting caught up on the same thing. So all of those speed bumps that a junior or a novice artist faces, I don't, right? And I have all of these workflows and all of these mistakes that I've made in behind kind of pushing me past those fairly quickly, right? So, and sometimes it can be very autonomous after you have that experience. So you're just free to imagine the more sophisticated problems and problem solve those on the fly, right? So, man, how long you'd spend on it? Well, that's as much time as I can, really. A lot of the way these questions are asked start to kind of, you know, feel like they require sort of like a formula. What should I be looking for? But the unfortunate thing there is there's no real formula. We can start to talk about kind of time scales, right? You shouldn't be taking 2 weeks to draw something like this, right? 80 hours, let's say. That's a long time, right? But I would be fairly lenient on a junior artist if they're struggling in their first time as a concept artist to get stuff done. I would definitely I would definitely kind of, thanks for the follow, be easy on them, right? And that's what you get out of a junior. You get to pay them way less because they have no experience, right? So you'll see a lot of studios bulk up on juniors, and then they'll have intermediates and leads lead them in the right direction. So, but for me, I think a character like this, I'd probably take, at least the way we're approaching it, 8 hours, 16 hours. If I really need to polish it up, maybe another day after that, right? But that's starting to get, you think about it in terms of the money somebody's spending, that starts to become a fairly pricey character design, right? So, yeah. So let's get back in there. So I'm going to grab some of that light value, and I'm going to start kind of building in on these guys some of that brighter value overall. So the value on these guys up in here is actually quite nice against that backdrop of lighter tones back here, right? But we can always exchange those values. The backdrop stuff can start to get dark instead, right? It's more important for us to achieve the goals of the piece than preserve things because we think they look pretty, right? As pretty as a zombie can be. Stuff blossoming out of its head. So I kind of want this to feel like a plate coming off of the front of the face like that, right? So I'm kind of connecting the dots with some of the values, the highlights that we're seeing come off of that. Now I'm getting into some pretty fun detail work. Again, would I do this every time? If I had more time, I probably would go through the entire pass again, right? But remember, we're talking about kind of just focusing on the head for a bit. That's a very pretty zombie. Okay, well, to each their own. Girls gotta eat. I like it. So you guys will start to also, I mean, in your own art, you'll find in your own concept art, you start to, certain things emerge, like your own style of rendering, your own style of stylization, character design, that kind of thing. But also motifs that you like and representations that you like. One of the things I for whatever reason, I love glowing eyes. I love the contrast of it. So I have to watch that I don't do that too much, right? Because I would find that, I'm doing this all the time. I put these glowing eyes on everything. So I have this desire to do that for our character here because she's going to have these spores glowing from within, but maybe I can hold off on that for now. If anything, I might put a milky eye in there so it looks like she's decayed for a while and is maybe blind in that eye, so like that cataracts of the eye in a way. Start with that. Maybe start getting kind of some of the lighting on the forms of the nose. So some of this highlight stuff is going to really help pull that form out from the shadows. So it starts to build that illusion of a volume in there, right? So it's going through and hitting those things. I can switch to my darker values as well and start building some of those in if I feel like I know where those will be, or if I want to set up stronger contrasts between some of these things. So I think her nose is going to really cast some shadows. These teeth are really faced away from that light, so I don't want them to be like insanely bright. Novice artists, these teeth, thinks white, they go and grab white, right? And then they go, and teeth. And we see how hilarious that looks, right? So it's sort of, I'm tempering it based on my light, based on the sense of the value difference between teeth and skin. So when you guys, if I'm smiling, you see my teeth, they're not white, right? The whitest thing in the camera would probably be the highlight on my mic or the catch light on my eye, right? So you can start to look at the world that way, right? And start to see like, oh, relative to this, that's not that bright. But because it sits, say, in the darkness of the shadow of the mouth, it does start to feel brighter, right? But I'm not kind of blowing up the contrasts in there. I'm working with some of that edge control. I want some of these things to feel a little bit sharper and then fade off to give it that sense that it's sort of like a pinched edge or a sharper edge. So like the eyebrow, the eyelid in there might be a nice one to do that with. Some of her skin is really starting to sag because she's been a zombie girl for a while now. I'm trying to keep it clean for Twitch's sake here. Some of these guys I think could really use that sharper edge, right? To pull them away from the head there. We might get a little bit of that blossoming actually pushing the skin out and giving it almost like this little bit of a skin fold in there as well, kind of creating creases in the face a little bit as that kind of comes out of the head. I will now kind of go into the base of that and start injecting some very dark values. Now, being careful of not going too far with my values, I might pull that up by a hint. Speaking to what we were talking about before with preserving some of that stuff just for finish face rendering or polishing. So I can probably skip some of this by just using a bigger brush and filtering some of that in here and there. That's where we can get some interesting undulations. So it's not all super uniform as it travels up. Thinking about the contours of these little nodes or these little fingers of what am I trying to say? Fungus. In there. Right. So now that is popping this guy in here, which I was, potentially worried about not reading as well because I'm getting rid of that darker edge that we originally had on it, right? But now since that's lighter, that will sit up really well against that backdrop of darkness in there. It's looking good already. Well, thank you. I try. So yeah, I mean, it's just like having patience though for this to look good is definitely something you want to start to build up. It's getting impatient and just getting straight to drawing the freckles underneath the eye, that's not going to help you overall, right? And so having a little bit of patience, you'll get there, but you need to give it some time to emerge. Yeah, we probably won't get to the finish for a little bit, so might be some multi-streams so you guys can see the evolution of this gal over time, because I do want to make sure that these things, happen in the proper amount of time that we can spend on it. Don't want to lose her lip too much down in there. The teeth, she's got her tongue out there a little bit, lower teeth. Oops. So yeah, if I were to satisfy the glowing eye vibe, we could have something that looks like that a little bit, which might look cool. So, I mean, just that little hit of really bright white, just that overexposure. There's no room left for detail in there because we can't add lighter values to that. We can only add darker values to that. So in terms of a glow, in terms of a light source, if we use white, there's nothing left, right? So we saw with the teeth relative to some of the darkness, if I allow for darkness to surround this thing, I don't necessarily have to use white to still make something feel like it glows. But using white in that one instance can really make it feel like an emissive light source, right? Yeah, and it does draw the attention, which is a problem if I don't want that to be the case. So if we back that up, she still feels like she has kind of this milky white eye, but it's not as important in the hierarchy of reading this thing. You know, if I start to add these, the brightness to these up here, then those guys will start to really kind of draw the eye. Then especially after that, you know, when I'd be closer to the end of the piece, I can add kind of bloom effects. And if I were to turn off the alpha lock, I can start to have these bloom, right? And now we start to get an inkling of what she might look like as she's kind of wandering through a cave or a dark night scene, right? You just see this almost like a lure fish, this glowing kind of mass wandering through in the back, right? And you could imagine for a game like The Last of Us, it could be an interesting gameplay dynamic where I have a beacon, an area that shows me where this creature is. And it could pulse and it could do all these different things. So it's really good to, as a concept artist, especially if you're working in video games and you know, it could be useful in film as well, but to help the designers in video games come up with ways that they could use systems to teach people mechanics. And so that can always be helpful there. But yeah, you see how that looks. But really trying to stay away from that for now, because that's more of like end game stuff that we can get in there. But we tried it out, we like it, so we know we're on the right track, maybe, right? So one of the other things that you can do to have your edges, have a little bit more control over your edges and not kind of have to draw super carefully, is to use your Marquee Selection tools. So say this element of fungus in here, I can select some of that on that, maybe that lower edge, to grab my airbrush, maybe grab a darker value and brush in against that edge just to sharpen it a little bit, for instance. So I can run along that entire edge, and when I let go, it's going to be razor sharp, right? So whenever you find you need to finesse that quality of edge control, then hey, use those tools, right? They're there for you. So yeah, that's feeling pretty good. I think some of her hair is going to actually kind of pull over her face. She might have more kind of blonde tips on her hair, just so that I like that sense of maybe the roots being a little bit darker as a nice gradient. So it's not all kind of just this uniform hair color value, I guess I should say. All right, so I can have some of that hair kind of coming up into that face there, starting to lose the uniform stroke of the original line work, which is nice, I think, because it's not something you see on a human's head, is giant chunky strokes to represent hair. So trying to be a little bit more beholden to reality there. So I turned off my alpha lock so that I can have some of that detail now leave the form. I might do some erasing while that alpha lock is off. What happens if your alpha lock is on and you erase is it will erase to the background color once again. So this is the problem we faced with our smudge tool, right? So if I smudge in, it's guessing that I want the background color to come in. So with alpha lock on, it's going to bring it to the background color. So my background color was red. You'd see Oh, I guess it's grayscale. So I guess it's only taking the actual value at that point, but I'd have to turn this to mode to RGB. Don't flatten. Now I should be able to get red in there, and there we go. So that's how you figure out you're working only with the grayscale. So that came from me kind of hauling in the original screenshot from Daz 3D, right? So it produced a canvas that was only set up in grayscale mode. So there you go. I figured it out, and I changed it back to RGB. So now we can be painting with more of those colors. Some of that coming off of her face in there. It has to be awesome feeling. Has to be an awesome feeling if you do a drawing and you know that you can make an awesome painting out of it. I didn't catch that before. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the goal for everybody, even people that are used to making art and can, you know, be confident in making something good. Most of the time, I think it's still a feeling that keeps you doing it, right? Insofar as you still fail at things as an artist. You'll see a lot of artists talk about that sense of almost imposter syndrome, where they don't think they're good enough, even though they have a ton of practice behind them, lots of experience, and are able to do something. It's just sort of this sense that because you've progressed slowly over time, that it doesn't feel like, you know, necessarily that there was one time where it clicked, right? Even though it's just taken these increments over time. I mean, that's really with the school, the whole point of it. It's like to give you the right direction for your practice. For concept art, it takes a lot of practice anyway, for any sort of kind of painting, right? It takes a long time to get this tied into this and get those things working really well as you produce work. Yeah, I think it's probably, well, I would bet that it's the same in any kind of creative or non-creative, really, enterprise. Like, I can imagine musicians and chefs feel the same way, right? Because there'll be a lot of trial and error and music making and culinary development, but sometimes you don't feel good about failing at that stuff, but it's really part of the game. So learn to kind of deal with it. So yeah, we're starting to develop some hair in here. I don't want to spend a ton of time doing this, but I kind of want to start to see what that will feel like the distance. So I'm pretty happy with that. But I want to maybe get back into making sure that these nodules on the head are at a good place. So grab some of that. I can start adding volume with a brighter value, but not white, certainly not white, to get these things feeling like they're biological forms in a way, right? Almost like weird teardrop guts in a way. I don't know. Maybe they'd look like that. You work in the medical field and you can confirm you felt like that in your first year. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough to gauge where you're at. How important is it an understanding of anatomy as an artist? It's important, right? Because imagine what do humans tend to tell for stories. Well, human stories, because we can resonate with them. Not every time, right? But a lot of the time. So you'll be drawing a lot of human characters, right? And then outside of that, we incorporate animals, so you're going to be drawing a lot of animal anatomy and so on. And so almost like anything, though, you need to know what something looks like to be convincing when you draw it. Otherwise, you're guessing, right? And people don't need to be artists or physicians to know that a body looks wrong. No, they don't have the responsibility to articulate why it looks wrong. They just know it does, right? Because they look at humans every day. We're spammed with that imagery. So yeah, I'd say it's very important to know anatomy, and anatomy practice is like a lifelong venture for artists, right? Some people are really into it and spend a lot of time. They get really good at it. But in general, as a rule of thumb, you should absolutely be familiarizing yourself with anatomy. Would you start coloring the image with the gradient maps, or do you use layer modes? Both. I tend to start with the gradient map now. I never used to, but it's just easier to kind of get rid of the grayscale, because then I can start painting in on top of that fairly easily with different blend modes, more gradient maps, whatever, right? And I can mask in and out that way, but at least the gradient map can kind of take away that grayscale. And the problem with the way I used to paint was that I'd have to be very careful about painting up to the edges of things so that I wouldn't leave little tiny chunks of gray in between, which the human eye can pick out really well, right? So it's more frustrating than anything. So I opted for changing my workflow a little bit towards gradient maps, which we won't talk about today in detail, but I'll get to in future streaming sessions. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, these different steps, right? They can be something you like or something you hate. For me, I like them all, for the most part, the same. What's surprising is I do get fairly bored with a piece after I've seen it for a really long time. So when would that happen? It's like when you're polishing a piece and a client wants this to go out to maybe print media. And so it has to be super clean, right? That can be a little bit of a struggle for me, because it's just like, I've seen this piece for weeks on end. And that's when you would have the budget to do that kind of thing, is if it's going to be kind of like a final asset for marketing or something. Yeah, the intro course, we spend some time on that to start to think about, where we would be looking, the beginning stages of understanding kind of proportions of the human body. And like I said, though, it's a long process to get it looking right, because the body is so complex. The forms are super subtle, from the bone to the organs to the muscle, even the sort of nervous system and cardiovascular system that kind of pushes through the body. So an arm can have all of that stuff, and that's why it looks like it does. And then you have sexual dimorphisms between male and female, which are, other aspects that change quite a bit. So lots of differences in there. So just like this, we start small. So yeah, we're starting to don't forget to kind of step away from your artwork to see kind of how it's reading, right? So that central sort of crevice in the head is darker now, and those two plates are coming out of it. The one that is kind of foreshortening towards the camera is so much easier to read against that darkness now that's fading into the head. Part of that can be light, part of it can be blood, or the gore coming out of that as well, or just discoloration from the actual material or fungus. Is it expected for a junior artist to know all of that, or do studios hire juniors more often for their potential? A little bit of both. I mean, two of the things I would say are very important for somebody that draws at all are to be practicing perspective and human anatomy to start, right? just spend 15 minutes a day, right? Just to begin that kind of habit, and draw people, learn about the structures, draw a skeleton, right? If you know how long an arm bone is, and you go to draw the character the next time and you realize, I've really been drawing really stunted arms because I'm not fitting in all the foundational structure of the body, that comes to the forefront of your mind faster, and you recognize your mistakes, right? But only because you've paid attention to it. So yeah, I'd say it's very important for you to be working on, for anybody. I mean, there are plenty of active concept artists, illustrators that spend a lot of time after years of working in the industry still making sure that they're practicing anatomy, because it can go away, right? If you don't use it, you lose it, because it's a lot of memory involved. Muscle memory, even, of drawing certain structures. So I feel like this cheek is almost going to be kind of crowding her nose a little bit, so creating a little bit of a fold in there. That's volume. So this maybe feels like a very swollen element on the face. So if I know that that's the way I'm going, I should probably develop that as a volume. Right, so makes your cheeks feel chubby, or at least the cheekbone feel a little bit chubby there as the swelling goes up. And then any of the kind of pinching around that eye, right, up in here. So I'm using that airbrush to draw lines a little bit, but I want to soften those as I kind of have those move around that corner and kind of grip around where this thing is kind of swirling out of the eye socket. Might even get a few little eyelashes coming off of that. Make it super gross. Just looking for little areas that I can plug in some volume detail, even on these stalks, which are going to eventually become fairly bright. Just leaving myself the option to make those more visible. If something gets out of control, then I can always move it back down into lower contrasts. It's becoming too bright. One of the biggest things as well is something I don't have up right now, just because I don't want to mess with the TOS on Twitch, is my reference file that I started with. So I had a bunch of different funguses on there to reference. So, I got a sense of what the fungus would look like. And I'm not just kind of making it up out of my memory of the last time I saw a slime fungus, right? Because I don't know how many times I've actually seen that I would remember it that well. So going and learning what the structures look like, what the light looks like, how it moves or lays on things, right, can be a really good way to inspire. If I'm going to move away from that at all, at least I have a firm understanding of what it is I'm referencing, right? So again, I'm not guessing as much, which is something that people will have a easier time of catching you out on. So you want to avoid it if you can. We're still thinking about that arrow up there, reflecting that light. Some of these to feel really stringy and feel like they're kind of pulling upwards. Twitch has a thing against gratuitous violence and gore. So not that the fungus stuff is in there. I was more speaking to the fact that those are people's pictures, right? That, you know, a concept artist is going to go on to Google Image and find pictures that people took to use as reference. So, but we don't want to be representing other people's photography and whatnot without their permission on Twitch. So that's why. But yeah, they also have like a gore thing. I think we're okay because it's character design related to, you know, say video game development. So people are out there right now playing, like, I'm sure, zombie games. And when The Last of Us comes out, I'm sure that's going to be one of the most streamed games as well. So we're okay on that level. So yeah, it's looking pretty good, I think. I mean, that's from that kind of blocked out. I mean, let's even go look at what this was before in here. Turn that line layer on. So we kind of went from that today, really roughing it out, to this so far. So pretty good progression with those simple, thanks for the follow, those simple methods, right, of kind of moving forward with this stuff. So is there a moment where you couldn't draw something because it was too creepy reference wise? My demonic book took me a while because of a phobia. Yeah, not really. I mean, I spent years drawing zombies for games, a mobile game called oh man, I can't believe I forgot it. It's always like references to dead and dead things. So wow, I can't remember. A zombie game I did for I keep wanting to say Left 4 Dead, but that's just one of my favorite zombie games. And then I only remember the code name that we used for the game. Anyway, I drew for a couple of years zombie stuff for a mobile game, and then before that, I was working on Resident Evil Raccoon City, and so I designed the characters for that with in collaboration with Capcom. So that was really fun. But in those cases, I wanted to really have a firm understanding of what the body looked like decayed, what the body looked like when it was, smashed up. So you can imagine at that point where it starts to become like you can go down that dark road of actually seeing that stuff, or you reference other artwork and that kind of thing. So just depending on where you're at with phobias and your comfort level with that stuff, you don't have to go and disturb yourself, right? There's definitely ways you can find an alternate route of referencing things, right? So like you could look at butcher meat, right, instead of human flesh, which will probably save you some nightmares there. But I delved into the dark stuff, and yeah, I mean, you're gonna see, if you're gonna do that, you're gonna see disturbing stuff. So I would, if you're at all sensitive, then stay away for sure. Yeah. Are zombies your favorite things to draw? I like drawing them. I've drawn them so much that whatever at this point. I feel comfortable drawing them. I do like kind of the gory stuff and the creepy creature design, the monsters, right? So I tend towards that, I guess. So yeah, I like it. It can be really fun. More so than I like drawing cutesy stuff. Right, you'll see some people out there that really like kind of very cute designs, chibis, whatever, right? Very, let's say, safe for work stuff, right? So to each their own at that point. If I had to choose between different projects that were working on things, then I'd probably choose monsters over anything sort of child friendly, I guess. But it's not to say that I wouldn't work on those things, right? Okay. The FBI list. Yeah, you want to stay away from anything that'll get you in trouble on the internet, which can sometimes be hard just when you're not even intending to look at zombie reference, right? So be careful out there. It's a minefield. It's feeling pretty good. I'm not too worried about some of this stuff needing more work because I can always come back to that detailing later, depending on how much time I have. But you know, I don't want to get too caught up in some of these things. So it's feeling good for the most part. Again, some of these extremities are going to be brightened by the end. So if I spent a ton of time working on details in like a section like this, I'm probably not going to see the fruits of my labor by the end because I intend to kind of almost like blow it away with exposed light, right? So being careful not to go too far with it. So I want some of this hair to be kind of maybe even being pulled off of the scalp by these growths. And get the eyebrow in there. Some darker values in this side of her face just because I feel like that is definitely turned away from the light. Even that eyeball in there. She might be throwing down a little bit of a double chin as she kind of compresses her face into her neck, right? So you might get some kind of skin folds dropping in there. Those kinds of things can be really handy to, you know, especially with the zombie, kind of making the ugly face, right? So it doesn't, you don't feel like, oh, that's a very attractive zombie, right? You want to be repelling the audience, not kind of drawing them into it. Well, I mean, in a lot of cases, maybe sometimes you do want to make pretty zombies, depending on what your client's after. Do I have any art books from games or movies? Yeah, I think you can see them behind me. Those are all art books, all of them. So yeah, I have a lot. Not all from games and movies, but you know, just to actually, I mean, on the topic of The Last of Us, their art book from the first game is really good. I think, I mean, some of the artwork I could take or leave, but that's just subjective opinion at that point. I mean, obviously they made a fantastic looking game and amazing art direction and whatnot. I mean, you'll still have your favorite kind of art, right? But that's a really good book to show sort of the range of artwork that a concept artist would produce for a game, right? Another one would be The Art of Doom is a good one. What else have we got? Yeah, Art of Doom's a good one. There's a Final Fantasy. I don't remember which Final Fantasy book, but they in general, the Final Fantasy books tend to be good anyway because they'll throw every piece of concept art in their books. So yeah, I'd check maybe some of those out. Yeah. Let's keep plugging away at this gal. So I'm feeling pretty good at this point with her. I'm going to leave. I feel like I can maybe wedge in some more darkness in the middle there, but there we go. I'm trying to catch myself from doing that because, you know, I can really just revisit that at the end. So maybe I'll go and kind of clean up some of these forms a little bit, lock that in, start to draw in some of these values in here. Heavy metal, yeah, classic. I used to read lots of heavy metal when I was younger. It seemed to have a better kind of distribution back before the internet. Which makes me feel old. Thanks for that. No, I'm kidding. Oh, the internet. I remember how excited I was when when the internet really became mainstream. The old, really slow modems to just download an image would just be like load, 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 line by line. Ridiculous, and considering how fast things can be these days. One of the things you can also do is get in here with a sharpening pass. I don't tend to like doing that, but you'll see some artists really kind of sharpen the edges of their strokes, because the way you lay things down in Photoshop, it can tend to dither the pixels as a way of blending it and not looking super aliased. But like we could take a look at what that would look like here in terms of a sharpen. I go to an unsharp mask. You see it just sort of highlighted all of the blending brush stipple, right? Which could be useful if I were laying down a lot of texture. Maybe I would do that later in the render phase for this. But if I go and start painting in on top of that, we're going to get back to that blurry stroke again. And so I'm going to have this contrast of sharp detail versus that softer stroke. So would I do this now? Probably not. You know, now we turn that off, it starts to feel pretty blurry, right? But at a distance, we don't notice that as much. So there might be at the end a pass where I would go in and kind of tighten that up a little bit, but not right now. Maybe not at all if I don't feel like doing it. I feel like I'm achieving the looks that I need. So that forehead in here and behind these guys, I'm going to kind of create some more contrast, just because, again, I'm subduing the importance of her face a bit. She's sort of the vessel for this spore, right? So she's less important. And you'll also see that in character design for certain creatures and characters in games and film, where if it's not important that that individual character is this sort of special case or interesting personality or boss character or main character at all, there you don't want certain features to be highlighted, or even the face to be highlighted on the zombie as much. So the knock-on effect of me actually having her face tilted down away from the light might mean, because of that shadow, we don't pay attention a lot to her. That's going to be a darkness that these bright spores can bounce off of as well and make it even harder for us to read. So yeah, we're really pushing her into the background for the spore to really live its best life. As ridiculous as that sounds. I feel like I need to draw a little bit more of the skin up into these spores on that part of the face. So really play with that. How long have I been doing this professionally? I started in games I went through university, got a fine arts degree. And then when I got out of that, I started at Electronic Arts as a game tester to try to become a concept artist in 2005. 2004. And then I became a concept artist in 2005. A junior after I left EA, and I went to a studio that Activision bought called Radical. And that's where I worked on Crash Bandicoot prototype. So that's where I got my start. So all the way back then, right? So it's been a while now. And so, yeah, doing it a while. this stage I can start to kind of add a little bit of bruising or swelling, damage, you know, spots as well in here. Would I do this normally? Again, no. I'd probably have gone through the rest of this character and kind of worked through some of that stuff, right? In the same way that we've treated it so far. But because we're focusing mainly on the head today, I can start sneaking some of that in. So thinking about kind of blisters and stuff starting to form because the integrity of the flesh is failing after the character's been dead for a bit. So we can do things like freckling or blistering or any sort of blemish that you might think that the face has or is important to kind of show. Right. Some of them can be really kind of airbrushy and feel like they're deep underneath the skin, right? And then we start to kind of get that look that we so desire. Could give her chipped teeth, broken teeth, crooked teeth, whatever we want in there. Wouldn't focus too much on it. One of the things you want to stay away from when you're drawing teeth is drawing the sort of individual like lines between teeth, right? It just starts to look way too graphic, and it overall just the contrast too intense. It looks goofy, so just stay away from that. Get a little bit of brightness on the lip. She might be having an extra bad day and kind of have the stained mouth from all of her zombie shenanigans. Something like that. If I were to start to lose too much of her chin in there, I can always indicate some volume, especially if she's kind of like got fluid on her chin or like blood or whatever kind of whatever stuff that you'd see on a body like this coming out. You know, you can pull some of that stuff out with a contrast, but I'm not using white, right? Because we'd know that would maybe draw way too much attention in there. So yeah, I can start kind of getting that vibe going on. Lip there. Yeah, I worked on the Crash Tag Team Racing. I worked on Mind Over Mutant, and can't remember what the other one was called. It's been a while. And then an unannounced one that never saw the light of day, but yeah, there were fun projects to work on. So was Prototype. Prototype was a really fun project. That one had kind of zombies in it or monsters in it as well. So that was fun to work on for sure. Twin Sanity. No, Twin Sanity was the game before I got involved at Radical. And I don't think Radical produced Twin Sanity. I know that is definitely a beloved game. Look forward to more sessions. Hopefully I get to work with you in the course. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And this has been great. It's going to be gross to get into the creative community. Yeah. Well, thanks for showing up. I appreciate it, gang. Yeah, and we'll be continuing to do this on the regular into the future. So keep your eyes peeled. We won't always be working on zombies, so do other fun things that are not dead or don't have to do with apocalypse. As I'm sure we're all pretty full up on the old apocalypse stuff at the moment. Might have some of that sag out of that eye a bit more. Yeah, she's starting to look good, or at least look like a zombie a bit more. Sharpen some of those edges up a bit. Yeah, feeling pretty good about that. Whoops, grab some of that light and kind of bring that down into here. I feel like those are going to be all in shadow, actually, so I'm just going to kind of darken that underside of all of this. Just pulling that ridgeline out, right? It's really nice. All right. So we'll probably wrap up here for this stream. But hopefully you guys have seen sort of like how we approach it, just again to kind of give you context of where we were at before we started, and just in a couple of hours getting to a place where we're really starting to pull out some of those volumes, some of the values even we're establishing for later development and making the character read overall. Right. So, you know, we're dealing with the head, then we can deal with the torso, and there's lots of really cool, fun things we can do in there and down into the legs and the feet as well. So once we would get through all of that, we're going to have a nice basis to get into some color. So probably by next week, I'm going to work on some of this outside of the stream, just so that we can kind of progress into some of those other workflows and when we get into color and polish. So yeah, you guys can expect to see that next week. Okay, but say thank you for the attention, and some really good questions in there. So try some of the stuff out on your own. See if you can produce that look, and we will see you guys next time.